Good morning. I'm going to talk about the racial wealth gap and then a policy proposal that me and my colleague Sandy believe that can eliminate the racial wealth gap probably in about 2 or 3 generations. So the advantages of wealth in our society are clear. Wealthier families are better positioned to finance elite independent schools, college education, access capital to start a business, finance expensive medical procedures, reside in higher amenity neighborhoods, exert political influence through campaign finance, purchase better counsel if confronted with an expensive legal system, leave a bequest, and/or withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies. In sum, wealth provides opportunity for human and capital investments and the economic security to take risk and shield against financial loss. Okay? Before the Great Recession, the typical black family had a little less than a dime for every dollar in wealth as a typical white family. After the recession, the gap nearly doubled, with the typical black family now having about a nickel for every dollar in wealth as a typical white family. The black-white wealth gap is in excess of $100,000, with the median black family now having less than about $6,000 in net worth. Like, as I mentioned, my colleague William Darrick has pointed out that the typical black household would have to save 100% of their income for about 3 consecutive years to close the gap. Regardless of age, household structure, education, occupation, or income, the typical black household has less than a quarter of the wealth of otherwise comparable white households. Perhaps even more alarming, white household heads who dropped out of college have higher net wealth than typical black head of households who graduated from college. Despite the long-standing pattern of structural racial inequality, there's an emergent post-racial or colorblind ideology which asserts that racial discrimination and other social barriers have mostly been eliminated, and that the black American narrative of victimhood is over. Instead of continuing to play the victim card, blacks are enjoined to take personal responsibility and recognize their own fault in the persistence of racial inequality. The roots of this discourse, put forth by conservatives, liberals, whites, and blacks alike, can be traced to the 1965 Moynihan Report, in which black families are characterized as being caught up in a tangle of pathology. But if racial barriers are largely a thing of the past, what explains the dramatic and persistent racial wealth gap? The conventional explanations are, first, in search of immediate gratification, blacks are less frugal when it comes to savings. So Bernard Anderson talked about this earlier. However, it is not historically the case, nor is it now the case that blacks are more profligate than whites. Economists ranging from the conservative Milton Friedman to the recently deceased founder of the Caucus of Black Economists, Marcus Alexis, to the most recently published article by Maury Gittleman and Ed Wolf, all find that after accounting for household income, blacks actually have a slightly higher savings rate than whites. Okay. The second conventional explanation, so this is a little in disagreement with what Bernard Anderson talked about with regards to financial literacy. The second explanation, well this is consistent, I'm going to rebut it. The second explanation is the claim that inferior black portfolio management has resulted in lower asset returns. However, the same Gittleman and Wolf study, based on data before the predatory subprime mortgage market crisis, finds no significant racial difference in asset appreciation rates once household income is controlled for families with positive assets. This provides another example in which the conventional explanations, namely that blacks possess a lower financial acumen, is not empirically supported. Indeed, the finding mentioned earlier that white families whose head dropped out of high school have a higher median wealth than black heads with a college degree demonstrates that not even a college degree shields black families from low levels of asset accumulation. The actual explanation is grounded in sound empirical evidence is that racial differences in inheritance, bequest, and intra-family transfers account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicators, including income and education and household structure. Beginning with the 300 years of slavery in which blacks themselves were considered material assets for whites, there's a long history of government, institutional, and individual acts of discrimination that have limited the ability of black families to acquire and transfer wealth from one generation to the next. This history includes the exclusion of blacks at local levels from post-Depression and World War II public policies, which are largely responsible for the asset development of a white American middle class. The biased treatment of blacks in asset markets is not limited to the past. For example, a February 2009 study on mortgage lending and race conducted by the Institute of Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota reveals that black Twin City residents in the highest earning categories, those earning above $150,000, were twice as likely to be denied a home loan in comparison to whites in the lowest earning categories, those below $40,000. It's also the case that among those fortunate or unfortunate enough to actually get a loan, high-earning blacks were more than 3 times as likely to be offered a subprime loan in comparison to the whites in the lowest earning categories. Indeed, Margaret Kimberly, an editor for the Black Agenda Report, describes the foreclosure crisis as a new form of wealth transfer from black Americans. So what can we do about the racial wealth gap? Market forces and private actions alone are insufficient. The most efficient way would be a carefully targeted, redistributive, race-based policy. If it is the case that such policies are becoming increasingly politically unfeasible, then we need a shift to dramatic and bold policies that lead to economic security, mobility, and sustainability for all Americans, while targeting for eligibility the characteristics and outcomes in which we are most racially disparate. So, Sandy and I propose a substantial child development trust fund program, or baby bonds program, as coined by the recently deceased Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and scholar of African American studies, Manning Marable. The baby bonds program would be designed to promote an opportunity for asset development for all newborns, regardless of race and the financial position in which they are born. Since about 85% of black families have a net worth below the median household in the U.S., it is clear that the vast majority of the nation's wealth, along with the associated opportunities stemming from this wealth, are skewed heavily towards a relatively few who are predominantly white. Yet even among only whites, less than 10% of families hold more than 50% of total white household wealth. The richest 20% of the entire population holds over 80% of the nation's wealth, while the top 1% holds nearly 40% of the nation's wealth. The baby bond program that we propose would progressively endow every newborn with a trust account and could, in about 2 or 3 generations, substantially close the racial wealth gap. The average account could be about $15,000 per child and incrementally rise to $60,000 for newborns born into the most wealth-poor families. The accounts would grow at a federally guaranteed annual interest rate of 1.5% to 2%. The accounts could be accessed when the child becomes an adult and used for some asset-enhancing endeavor, such as purchasing a home or starting a new business. Program concerns around savings crowding out can be ameliorated by structuring the program in a manner similar to the Earned Income Tax Credit program, which uses a phase-out schedule to avoid work disincentives. Also, there may be concerns that the program may influence the timing in which parents, grandparents, or other relatives make transfers to their offspring, so that the children of these offspring can increase the federal bond support in which they qualify. To address this moral hazard, the federal government could reserve the right to tax future transfers to baby bond recipients. If all the roughly 4 million babies born per year were eligible for the program, a crude estimate of the program's cost would amount to about $60 billion a year. Although this simple estimate does not incorporate costs resulting from increased fertility incentives, it also does not incorporate savings resulting from the reduction in other federal transfer programs associated with better resourced young adults. This cost could be fully funded based on a fraction of what the federal government already spends on asset-enhancing activities. A 2004 report by the Corporation for Enterprise Development estimates that the federal government allocated $335 billion of its 2003 budget in the form of tax subsidies and savings to promote asset development policies. An updated version of this study puts that allocation closer to around $400 billion. The bulk of this allocation comes from items like mortgage interest deductions, exclusion of investment income on life insurance, annuity contracts, reduced rates of tax on dividends and long-term capital gains, and exclusion of capital gains at death. The total allocation, which is about 15 times higher than what we spent in the Department of Education, does not include subsidies or tax breaks given to corporations, nor from state and local level policies. At issue is not the amount that's allocated towards asset promotion. At issue is to whom it's distributed. The top 1% of earners, those typically earning over $1 million a year, received about 1/3 of the entire allocation, while the bottom 60% of earners received only 5%. If the federal asset promotion budget were allocated in a more progressive manner, federal policies could be transformative for low-income Americans. The baby bonds proposal provides a far more progressive, opportunity-enhancing, and it is a lot less expensive than many of the asset tax policies already in existence. The proposal could be funded by simply capping the mortgage interest deduction for wealthy families. A positive indirect consequence from the baby bonds program would be an enhanced incentives of youth self-investment, especially in this context that puts all this onus on personal responsibility. Youth who lack motivation as a result of perceived limited opportunities as an adult might be incentivized to self-invest as a result of an enhanced opportunity stemming from a baby bond. The concern that the enhanced resources from the baby bond program may generate complacency amongst its recipients should be minimized, since the baby bond program is not designed as a cash transfer, but rather seed money for an asset-enhancing investment that benefits from self-investment to manage those assets. A negative indirect consequence from the baby bonds program would be the enhanced incentive of predation from the financial institutions aimed at exploiting the larger share of young adults with financial capital to invest. Thus, a well-designed baby bond program should be coupled with financial reform to curtail those incentives. So, to truly become a society consistent with the most comprehensive norms of a post-racial or colorblind society, the United States needs to get beyond the unsubstantiated rhetoric that attributes a deficit in personal responsibility on the part of blacks as the explanation for racial inequality, and instead get to the business of eliminating the transmission of racial economic advantage or disadvantage across generations. Public provisions of a substantial trust fund for newborns from well-poor families would go a long way towards achieving this American ideal, and it would provide asset-building opportunities and access to economic security for all Americans, regardless of race.